Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in the history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we start, please leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and when you heard this story. We want to know where these documented accounts come from and when they come in. The Appalachian Mountains' forgotten trails hide stories that have been buried on purpose. People only talk about these stories in whispers on cold winter nights when the wind howls through the pines. In 1919, after the Great War, America was trying to get back to normal. But in a remote part of the Blue Ridge Mountains, something very strange was going on. This is the written story of the Mountain Brothers and the travelers who never made it home. In 1919, Harrison County, West Virginia. The war was over, and soldiers were going back home. People were traveling on the country roads more than ever to see family or look for new job opportunities in the economy after the war. The Spanish flu pandemic that had destroyed so many communities was finally starting to go away, and people were beginning to feel cautiously hopeful. There were a lot of people on the trains, and those who couldn't pay for a ticket took to the roads. They would often hitchhike or walk through the mountain passes that connected the isolated communities of Appalachia. As people moved around, reports started to come in about travelers who left nearby towns and headed east through the mountain pass, but never made it to their destinations. The Harrison County Sheriff's Department's official records showed that 15 people went missing between March and October of 1919, but local newspapers say that the real number may have been much higher. On the 12th of July, 1919, the Clarksburg Daily Telegraph published a short article saying that there had been an unusually high number of people passing through the county who did not make it to their planned destinations. The article said that this was because of the general chaos of post-war movement. The Blackwell Pass, a narrow mountain road that connected several coal mining towns, became known locally as the Vanishing Road. What made these disappearances so scary was that they were so selective. Most of the people who went missing were solo travelers, often people who were just passing through and didn't have strong ties to the local communities. These were people that few people would miss right away. Local officials said that these people probably died in accidents in the dangerous mountain terrain, or they may have just kept going without telling anyone. The public records show that Sheriff Thomas Caldwell officially closed most of these missing persons cases with the note, "Presumed departed area, no evidence of foul play." However, papers found in 1,963 inches, Sheriff Thomas Caldwell's private files, tell a different story. Caldwell's personal journal, which was found in the attic of his granddaughter's house in Charleston, says that the sheriff had been keeping a pattern of the disappearances secret from official reports. The journal, which covers the time from February 1919 to December 1920, talks about how Caldwell became more and more suspicious of two brothers who lived in a remote homestead near the highest point of Blackwell Pass. The leather binding of the journal was cracked from age, and many of the pages were damaged by water, but the careful handwriting was still clear enough to show an unsettling investigation that was never recorded in official records. People in the area called Jeremiah and Elias Thornhill the Mountain Brothers. The siblings had lived in the area all their lives. Their father, who had been a moderately successful trapper before the turn of the century, left them a small piece of land. Tax records from 1910 show that the brothers ran a small rest stop for travelers crossing the pass. They provided simple meals and sometimes a place to stay for people who got stuck in the mountains after dark. Local maps only showed their business as Thornhill Rest, and it was listed in travel guides of the time as a small but useful stop for people crossing Blackwell Pass. Church records from the Mount Zion Baptist Church in Millbrook, which is close by, show that the brothers went to services every now and then when they were young, but they became more reclusive after their father died in 1908. The pastor's notes from 1911 said that the Thornhill boys have taken to their mountain ways entirely now. Appearing in town only for supplies and offering little in the way of conversation, the tax assessor's notes from 1915 said that their property was a main dwelling of moderate size, well-maintained, with 2 outbuildings and about 12 acres of cleared land surrounded by forest. Sheriff Caldwell was suspicious of the brothers, not just because they were alone, but also because of reports from people who had met them and lived to tell the tale. Caldwell wrote in his journal on the 17th of April 1919, spoke with Malcolm Reed today regarding his journey through the past last week. Reed reports that upon stopping at the Thornhill place, he was offered a meal and lodging for the night. He describes Jeremiah as uncommonly interested in his business affairs and destination. When Reed mentioned he was expected in Charleston the following day, the brothers' demeanor reportedly changed. They withdrew the offer of lodging, served him a hastily prepared meal, and suggested an alternate route that would get him to his destination much quicker. Reed, who knew the area well, realized that the suggested path would have taken him hours out of his way through particularly remote terrain. If Reed's story hadn't been backed up by other travelers' stories, it might have been seen as an odd meeting. Caldwell's journal has at least 4 similar stories, from April to July of 1919. Each one talks about how the brothers were interested in where travelers were going and how their behavior changed when they found out that someone was expected at a certain time and place. The 29th of May 1919. Entry tells the story of a traveling salesman named Howard Greaves. Greaves says that when he told the brothers about his sales route, which included regular stops in Clarksburg and Charleston where his associates were expecting him on certain dates, they didn't seem interested in talking anymore. Even though it was late and the weather was bad, they didn't offer him a place to stay, as they usually do. Instead, they gave him directions to make his trip shorter. People in the area had mixed feelings about the brothers, with some respecting them and others feeling uneasy. An article in the Harrison County Gazette from the 3rd of June 1919 says that the brothers were known for their knowledge of the mountains and the plants that could be used as medicine. They sometimes gave people in the area medicines to help with their health problems. Jeremiah Thornhill gave me a tincture that cured my husband's persistent cough when the doctor in Clarksburg had all but given up. They may keep to themselves, but there's no denying they know the old mountain ways, said Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker, who has lived in Millbrook for a long time. However, the same article said that not many people ever visited their homestead, and the brothers rarely went down to the nearby towns, except to get supplies. The County Historical Society has a ledger from Thompson's General Store in Millbrook that shows how the brothers bought things from 1917 to 1919. The records show that the people bought a lot of salt, sugar, flour, and supplies for preserving food, which is what you would expect from someone who lived alone in a remote area. When looked at in light of later discoveries, the number of some things, especially salt and preserving jars, seemed too high for a 2-person household. In late summer of 1919, things got worse. Caldwell's journal entry from August 29th says, "Found an abandoned wagon about 2 miles east of the Thornhill property. It belongs to J. Hamilton, a merchant from Clarksburg, who was reported missing 3 days ago. The horse is missing, and the cargo of dry goods and other items is gone. There is a strange marking carved into the wagon seat that looks like a simple symbol of crossed lines. This is the second such marking found on the missing person's property this month. The symbol, as described in Caldwell's journal and later drawn by a deputy, was made up of 2 lines that crossed each other with small marks at each end, which looked like a rough representation of a crossroads or junction. Anthropologists who looked into the case later said it could have been a way to mark territory or, even more disturbing, a way to keep track of things. Later, the same symbol was found carved into a number of trees along remote paths in the area, all within 5 miles of the Thornhill property. What happened next in the journal suggests that Caldwell started a secret investigation of the brothers, but he was careful not to scare them. He asked Deputy Michael Fitzgerald for help. The journal says that Fitzgerald went to the Thornhill homestead on the 12th of September 1919, pretending to be a traveler. Caldwell carefully transcribed Fitzgerald's report, which tells of a disturbing event. The main cabin, which could be seen from the road, and 2 outbuildings that were partly hidden by the trees around them, made up the property. A rough wooden sign at the entrance to the homestead said, "Rest, food, supplies," and had a small arrow pointing to the cabin. Fitzgerald said that when he got closer, he saw both brothers on the porch. However, Jeremiah quickly went back inside when he saw the visitor. Fitzgerald's report says that Elias welcomed him warmly, offered him water for his horse, and suggested that he take a break before continuing on his way. Fitzgerald said that while Elias talked to him about his travels, Jeremiah went into one of the outbuildings and stayed there for almost 30 minutes. The deputy said that the inside of the main cabin was surprisingly well decorated for such a remote area, with nice furniture that didn't seem to match the brothers' apparent means. He especially noticed a fancy clock on the mantel that looked like it was made in Europe, and a bunch of leather-bound books that didn't seem to fit in a mountain cabin. Fitzgerald noticed that Jeremiah had changed his shirt when he got back, even though it was cool outside and he hadn't been doing any physical work. The brother didn't say why he had changed clothes or why he wasn't there. Fitzgerald also said that he heard what he thought was movement in the loft above the main room, which was even more worrying. The brothers said they lived alone, though. Elias quickly said that the sound was just the timbers settling and changed the subject. When Fitzgerald asked if he could buy supplies for his trip, he was taken to a storage shed that had an unusual amount of different personal items, like clothes in different sizes, watches, books, and other things that a traveler might have. Elias said that they often traded with travelers who were low on money and needed food and supplies. They would give them personal items in exchange for food and supplies. Fitzgerald's report said that some of the items looked very valuable, like a gold pocket watch with the words, "To Thomas," on the occasion of 25 years of service, Wellington, Coal and Rail, 1917 engraved on it. This matched the description of something that Thomas Burnside, a railway worker who went missing while traveling through the area in July 1919, had said was missing. The deputy also saw more than 20 walking sticks and staffs hanging on the wall of the storage room. Jeremiah said that they made the collection out of local wood and sold it to travelers when he talked about it. Fitzgerald did say, though, that some of them looked well used and had carved initials or unique handles that made it look like their previous owners had carried them for a long time. Fitzgerald's story about how the brothers acted as night fell was probably the most disturbing. They kept telling him to keep going, even though it was late, and suggested a way down the mountain that would take him to a small village where he could find a good place to stay. Fitzgerald wrote that Jeremiah became visibly nervous as the sun began to set. He kept checking the sun's position through the window and told the deputy to leave before darkness makes the path hard to follow. Fitzgerald thanked them and left, following Caldwell's orders to keep his cover. However, instead of taking the suggested path, he hid in the woods near the property. Caldwell's journal shows that what he saw over the next few hours would later become known as the Mountain Brothers case. About an hour after sunset, a man on foot carrying a small backpack walked up to the homestead. Fitzgerald watched from his hiding place as the man was warmly welcomed and invited inside. The lights in the cabin stayed on for about 45 minutes. During that time, the deputy could sometimes see shadows moving past the windows. Fitzgerald then said he heard a sharp cry that stopped suddenly. After that, there was the sound of something heavy being pulled. Not long after, both brothers came out of the house and went to one of the outbuildings with what looked like a body wrapped in a blanket. They stayed in the outbuilding for almost an hour. During that time, Fitzgerald saw light moving inside, which he thought was a lantern. They finally came out with a few buckets, which they emptied into a pit far away from the main buildings. Then they covered the pit with dirt and pine needles. Fitzgerald went back to Harrison County right away to tell Caldwell what had happened. The journal says that Caldwell wanted to organize a search of the Thornhill property, but he needed to get enough people to help make sure it went well. A note from September 14th says, "Have telegraphed Charleston for more deputies. Will go to the Thornhill property when the reinforcements arrive, which is expected to be Tuesday next. I've told all the men to be careful. If Fitzgerald's observations are correct, we may be dealing with people who are dangerous." The journal also has a hand-drawn map of the Thornhill property based on Fitzgerald's observations, showing the main cabin, outbuildings, and the pit where the brothers had thrown away the contents of the buckets. Caldwell said he would focus the search on this area and the outbuilding where the wrapped body had been taken. What happened next is still one of the strangest parts of the case. Both Caldwell's journal and later newspaper articles say that when the sheriff's posse got to the Thornhill homestead on September 17th, they found it completely empty. There were signs that they had to leave quickly. Food left on the table, clothes still hanging on the washing lines. But there was no sign of where the brothers were or where they were going. Caldwell writes in his journal that day, "Property deserted, no trace of T. Brothers. Fire in stove cold, but wood still present. Suggests departure within past 24-48 hours. Question remains as to how they received warning of our approach. This question would never be fully answered, but later research showed that the telegraph operator in Charleston had a cousin who worked at Thompson's General Store in Millbrook. This led to the idea that word of the upcoming raid might have gotten out through this connection. Caldwell himself came up with another idea in a later entry, that the brothers might have had a network of lookouts or informants among the local people. However, no proof ever came to light to back this up. The search of the property that followed found evidence that even the most experienced lawman was shocked by. The main outbuilding, which was built partly underground in the style of a root cellar, had a large work area with a variety of tools, such as butchering knives, saws, and other tools that were all well cared for. Next to this was a smaller room that had been carefully lined with wood to make a rough but useful cold storage area. Inside, investigators found proof that the brothers had been doing what the journal calls preservation activities. Clinical descriptions of what was found can be found in sealed documents from the Harrison County Courthouse that were not opened until 1963. There were human remains found in different states of preservation, both in the cold storage and in shallow graves on the property. The official report said that there were at least 11 bodies, but it was impossible to be sure of the exact number because some of the remains were in bad shape. The report said that some of the remains looked like they had been preserved using methods similar to those used in taxidermy, while others looked like they had been prepared for eating. Newspapers at the time downplayed this part of the case, only saying that there was evidence of foul play. The Harrison County Gazette's the 20th of September 1919 issue simply said, "Authorities have confirmed that the Thornhill brothers, who were previously of interest in connection with several missing persons cases, have fled their property following the discovery of incriminating evidence. A manhunt is currently underway." The paper didn't say anything about the terrible things that were found at the property, probably because the findings were so shocking and Sheriff Caldwell asked them not to. According to his journal, he was worried that detailed reports might cause panic and slow down the methodical search for the suspects. The journals found in Jeremiah Thornhill's personal space make this case even more disturbing. The journals, which covered almost 15 years, described what the brothers did in a cold, clinical way that investigators found more disturbing than any sign of malice would have been. The writing makes it sound like the brothers thought of what they did as a form of art rather than a crime. They kept talking about their preservation work and perfection of technique. One entry from the 3rd of August 1918 says, "Subject 27 was the best candidate for the new preservation method. The use of cedar oil after the salt treatment seems to stop the leather-like texture that has been a problem in the past. The result looks more lifelike, especially in the facial features." Elias says we should try the same method with Subject 28, which is expected to arrive within 2 weeks, according to the stage schedule we got in Millbrook. The journals also explain how the brothers chose their names. They mostly went after people who looked like they were just passing through the area, especially those who were traveling alone and didn't seem to be connected to nearby communities. They would talk to travelers to find out if anyone was waiting for them at their destination and how soon they would be missed. Those who were thought to be good enough would be asked to stay for a meal or to rest. The journals recorded what happened next with disturbing accuracy. An entry from the 5th of May, 1917, gives us an idea of how they worked. The application of the sedative to the evening meal continues to prove effective when administered in the proper dosage, 2 measures per cup of coffee. It induces a state of compliance without rendering the subject immediately unconscious. This allows for a more controlled transition to the preparation area. Subject 19 exhibited minimal resistance and was secured in the preservation room within 12 minutes of ingestion. The entire process was completed before midnight, allowing adequate time for cleaning and restoration of the main room before the potential arrival of any morning travelers. The journals show that the brothers had improved their method over many years of practice, coming up with ways to find good targets, quickly take them down, and get rid of any evidence. They kept detailed records on each subject, such as their physical traits, possessions, and the exact ways they were preserved. In some cases, they even wrote down the person's last words or actions, paying the same cold attention to detail that they did to all of their other records. The investigators found what they called the collection in a hidden room that could only be reached through a trapdoor in Jeremiah's bedroom. This was probably the most terrifying part. they found dozens of carefully organized personal items that had been taken from victims, like watches, wedding rings, photos, letters, and other mementos. Each item had a date and a simple number that matched up with entries in Jeremiah's journal. The collection was a very detailed way of keeping records that made it seem like there were many more victims than the bodies found on the property. One of the things found was a leather wallet that belonged to William Garfield, a traveling salesman from Ohio who went missing in 1916. It had his identification papers inside. The wallet had the number 14 on it and had Garfield's ID and a picture of what looked like his wife and other family members. A gold wedding band with the name of Subject 23 on it was later found to belong to Margaret Whitley, a Virginia schoolteacher who went missing in early 1918 while visiting family in Kentucky. The ring had a unique engraving on it. The search for the Thornhill brothers went on all winter long in 1919, 1920. Even though police from many counties and even federal agents were involved, they were never caught. Caldwell's journal shows how angry he was getting as leads dried up and sightings turned out to be false. On the 18th of November 1919, someone wrote, "Another reported sighting in Morgantown proves unfounded." The description matched, but upon investigation, the men in question were identified as miners recently arrived from Pennsylvania. I fear the brothers have found refuge in the deeper wilderness areas, where law enforcement presence is minimal or non-existent. There were reports of sightings in Tennessee and North Carolina, but none of them could be confirmed. Some reports say that the brothers may have split up and are now using different names to avoid being caught. Law enforcement agencies received physical descriptions of Jeremiah that said he was about 45 years old, 5'11" tall, had a slight build, dark hair that was graying at the temples, and a noticeable scar on his left forearm. Elias was described as being about 40 years old, 6'2" tall, having a sturdy build, a full beard, and a slight limp in his right leg. A telegram that Caldwell had from the authorities in Asheville, North Carolina, dated the 30th of November, 1919, said that a man who looked a lot like Elias Thornhill had been arrested. But by the time Caldwell made plans to go there to identify the suspect, he had been let go because there wasn't enough evidence and had disappeared again. The telegram said that the man had been working as a handyman at a local inn for about 2 weeks before he was arrested. His boss had said he was quiet, capable, and kept to himself. He didn't come back to get his last paycheck after being released, and when people asked, they found out he had been living in a rented room as Edward Thomas. The search went on through the winter and spring of 1920. Caldwell sent deputies to search the more remote parts of the Appalachian Range based on reports from hunters and trappers. On the 8th of January 1920, the journal says, "Informant Wilson reports finding an abandoned camp about 30 miles southeast of the original Thornhill property. The camp had several personal items that belonged to the brothers, including a distinctive carved pipe that Thompson identified as one he sold to Jeremiah in 1918. The camp looks like it was abandoned about a week before it was found. Deputies Collins and Reeves have been sent to look into the area around it." The last reliable sighting of either brother was in April 1920, when a former resident of Harrison County said they saw Jeremiah working as a butcher's assistant in a small town near Knoxville, Tennessee. James Whitaker, who had moved from Millbrook to Knoxville in 1915 and knew the Thornhills, said that he had gone to a butcher's shop and recognized Jeremiah, even though he had tried to change his look by shaving his head and growing a full beard. When Whitaker's eyes met Jeremiah's, he seemed to recognize him for a moment before quickly apologizing and going into the back room of the shop. By the time the police looked into it, the man who looked like Jeremiah had already left and didn't leave a forwarding address or say where he was going. The owner of the store said that the man, who said his name was Joseph Thomas, had only worked there for 3 weeks and left without getting his last week's pay. He said he had to leave right away because of a family emergency. In October 1920, Caldwell got an unmarked package at the sheriff's office, which made the case even stranger. The pocket watch inside was identified in official reports as belonging to Howard Phillips, a railroad engineer who went missing in June 1919 and was thought to be one of the victims. A note that said, "Still keeping perfect time," was wrapped around the watch. Handwriting analysis later showed that it was Jeremiah's handwriting. The package was sent from Johnson City, Tennessee, but investigators think this was probably a deliberate misdirection and not a sign of where the brothers really were. This would be the last time anyone heard from either of the Thornhill brothers. The investigation went on, but it got less and less intense over the course of 1920 and into 1921. As the trail got colder, Caldwell's journal entries show that he was becoming more and more resigned. A note from March 1921 says, "It has been 6 months since the last confirmed communication from J. Thornhill, and over a year since any credible sighting of either brother. While I remain convinced they continue their activities elsewhere, I am forced to acknowledge that the resources available for their pursuit are no longer sufficient, given the lack of fresh evidence." As months turned into years, with no new information, the case slowly lost interest from the public. No family members came forward to claim the Thornhill property, which was still empty. The county took the land in 1925 because the owner hadn't paid their taxes. No one wanted to buy it, even though it had a bad reputation, or maybe because of it. The forest eventually took back the clearing, and by the time researchers from the West Virginia Historical Society tried to find the site in 1963, nature had almost completely covered up any signs of the homestead. We could only be sure of the stone base of the main cabin and the partial remains of the root cellar. Sheriff Caldwell was still obsessed with finding the brothers when he retired in 1931. He kept a detailed file of reported sightings and possible leads. According to what his granddaughter said during the Historical Society's investigation in 1963, Caldwell would often spend evenings going over maps of the Appalachian region, marking possible hiding places, and planning possible routes that the brothers might have taken. He never believed that they had just vanished. She remembered that he thought they had found another quiet place where they could continue their activities without being watched. He used to say, "Men like that don't stop. They just find new places to hunt." The Harrison County Gazette's obituary for Caldwell in 1946 briefly mentioned his part in solving one of the county's most famous criminal cases, but it didn't go into any detail. By that time, the Thornhill case had become a bit of a local legend, with many exaggerated versions going around among the people who lived there that didn't match the facts that were known. If it weren't for a discovery made by hikers in 1964 while exploring a cave system about 12 miles from the original Thornhill property, the case might have stayed a creepy footnote in local history. The students from Marshall University who were hiking and doing a geological survey said they found what looked like the remains of a long-term campsite deep inside the cave system. Some of the things found were cooking tools, the remains of a rough bed, and a metal box with a few leather-bound journals inside. Local authorities got the journals and, realizing they might be connected to the Thornhill case, got in touch with the West Virginia Historical Society. They found what looked like a living space deep in the cave that had been used for a long time. Natural rock formations and plants hid the entrance to the cave so well that it was almost impossible to see unless you knew where to look. Researchers found evidence inside that someone had lived there for years, maybe even decades, in almost complete isolation. Several journals that looked like those found at the Thornhill homestead were among the things that were found. The journals had entries that went up to 1,943 and were written in a way that experts later said was the same as Jeremiah Thornhill's handwriting. There were other things in the cave, too. There were crude pieces of furniture made from local wood, tools that had been modified for different uses, and, most disturbing, a collection of bones that forensic analysis would later determine were human, even though they looked like they had been cooked and eaten. The cave journals give us a disturbing look into the mind of a man who had been on the run for decades but still thought of his actions as craftsmanship instead of crime. The first entries, which were written in 1920, talked about how the brothers ran away from home and tried to start a new business in a different place. But entries from late 1921 onward show that the brothers had split up, with Jeremiah feeling both angry and relieved that Elias had left. An entry from the 17th of November, 1921, says, "E has gone. We can't work together anymore because we disagree on how to do things. He doesn't have the patience needed for proper preservation, which rushes the process and hurts the results. His absence will let me work on improvements without interruption. The cave is private enough, but the limited access to subjects means I need to plan more carefully. Later entries talk about how Jeremiah has adjusted to living alone, including how he gets travelers to come to the cave, and how he gets better at preserving things. The writing gets more random as time goes on, and later entries show that the person's mental health is getting worse. There are now references to conversations with past subjects, which shows that Jeremiah had started to give the preserved bodies he kept in his secret home personalities and voices. An entry from 1937 says, "Number 41 keeps arguing against the new method, but he doesn't get the aesthetic principles behind it. Number 37 and number 32 both like the improvement. Their advice has been very helpful in improving the technique. The new subject coming tomorrow will benefit from their combined knowledge." The last journal had entries that made it seem like at least one of the brothers had been doing the same things for decades after they left Harrison County. The writing had become more and more random, with mentions of the hunger of the mountains, and claims that the author could hear the voices of the preserved ones telling him what to do. Some parts of the text suggest that Jeremiah had started to add ritualistic elements to his activities, such as ceremonial preparations and rules that must be followed to make sure the right transition from subject to guide. The last clear entry, from the 17th of March, 1943, says, "Elias has not spoken in 3 days. His breathing is getting harder by the hour. The infection in his leg has spread despite the poultices I made. The tools will begin the preservation process before dawn. My brother will be my best work. He will join the Council of Guides and complete our collection. The circle closes. The mountain provides." This entry made investigators ask a lot of questions. Did Elias really get back together with his brother at some point? Or was this proof that Jeremiah was crazy? The mention of an infected leg matched up with earlier accounts of Elias's limp, which makes it seem like the brothers may have gotten back together. However, there was no clear proof of a second person being in the cave, so the question remains unanswered. There were no human remains found in the cave that could be definitively identified as Elias Thornhill. However, forensic analysis of stains on a wooden table showed that there were different types of human blood present. A thorough search of the area around the site turned up no graves or other signs of where the bodies were disposed of. We still don't know what happened to the Thornhill brothers, but the journal entry suggests that Jeremiah may have tried to keep his brother alive after he died from what looks like a serious infection. The last journal ends suddenly after the entry for March 17th, and there are a few blank pages after that. It is still not clear if Jeremiah finished his last job as he said he would and then left, or if he got sick or hurt soon after and died. The cave's condition made it clear that it had been empty for a long time before it was found in 1964, and there were no signs that anyone had lived there recently. The Mountain Brothers case left a mark that goes beyond the terrible things they did. After the cave was found in 1964, researchers found at least 7 other cases in the Appalachian region between 1920 and 1950 where travelers went missing, and there was evidence of methodical, ritualistic activities similar to those of the Thornhills. Some criminologists have suggested that the brothers may have inspired copycat criminals, or that their isolation may have ended when they met others who were like them. However, there was no direct evidence of this. In 1966, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit wrote a report that said, "The Thornhill case shows signs of modern serial predator patterns, especially the methodical selection of victims, the ritualistic processing of remains, and the trophy-collecting behavior. What makes this case different from others is the craftsmanship mentality. The brothers saw their activities as a form of work or art, not just acts driven by psychological compulsions." This vocational approach to predation is a unique typology in criminal behavior studies. Dr. Eleanor Westcott, a forensic psychologist who studied the case in great detail in the late 1962, came up with a theory that the brothers may have been part of a bigger network. In a 1968 article in the Journal of Criminal Psychology, she wrote, "The methodical nature of the Thornhills' activities, along with the sophisticated preservation techniques described in their journals, suggests knowledge that may have been passed down or shared. The question remains whether the brothers developed these practices in isolation or whether they were initiated into an existing tradition. The geographical distribution of similar cases across the Appalachian region, spanning several decades, raises the possibility of a diffuse network of practitioners sharing techniques and perhaps even territories. Researchers looking at historical records in 1968 found that the Thornhill's father, Ezekiel, had traveled a lot in the Appalachian region in the 1,870 seconds and 1,880 seconds before settling in Harrison County. This gave the theory more weight. Records from different communities along the mountain range showed that Ezekiel worked as a trapper, guide, and sometimes an undertaker's assistant. The last job taught him how to preserve things. During this time, local newspapers in a number of places reported a lot of people going missing, especially travelers and people who worked on the road. Records show that there were a number of disappearances along his known travel routes during this time that were never solved, but there was never any direct evidence linking him to these cases. A researcher at the West Virginia Historical Society wrote in a report from 1968. The pattern of disappearances that followed Ezekiel Thornhill's movements through the Appalachian communities between 1,872 and 1,885 bears striking similarities to those later associated with his sons. While circumstantial, the evidence suggests that the practices documented in Jeremiah's journals may represent a continuation of activities initiated by the father. This intergenerational aspect of the case adds a particularly disturbing dimension to an already horrifying narrative. The notion that such practices could be taught and passed down like a family trade challenges conventional understanding of deviant behavior and raises questions about the role of isolation and cultural disconnection in the development of extreme antisocial activities. The Mountain Brothers case is a disturbing part of the Appalachian Mountains' hidden history. The rough terrain kept people away, and many people who traveled through the area during times of economic migration only stayed for a short time. This made it possible for the brothers to go unnoticed for years. The case is a reminder that the most frightening threats aren't always supernatural beings, but the quiet predators who live among us and wait for the weak to cross their path. What makes this case even more disturbing is that, despite years of thorough investigations after the first discoveries, authorities were never able to find all of the victims mentioned in Jeremiah's journals. The entries and items in the collection suggest that more than 50 people may have been hurt by the Mountain Brothers during their time of activity. Most of these victims are still missing and have not been claimed. Their disappearances may never have been officially reported or linked to the brothers' actions. According to a report from the West Virginia State Police Cold Case Unit from 1967, based on journal entries and collected evidence, we estimate that the Thornhill brothers may have been responsible for between 45 and 60 disappearances between 1,909 and 1,919, with Jeremiah potentially continuing these activities until at least 1943. Of these, only 17 victims have been positively identified through recovered personal effects or other evidence. The remainder constitute a silent population of the missing, whose fates, while strongly suspected, cannot be conclusively determined. People still use the mountain trails to get to the passes where the Thornhill brothers used to wait. Official maps and historical markers have left out the exact location of their homestead on purpose, partly out of respect for the victims, and partly because they didn't want to draw in people who were curious. Still, local guides say that hikers sometimes ask how to get to the site because they are drawn to the case's creepy appeal. The County Historical Society talked about whether or not to include the Thornhill case in a complete history of the area that was being written in 1966. Minutes from their meeting show that there was a heated debate about the ethics of writing about these events. Some members thought the story should be told as a cautionary tale, while others were worried that the brothers' crimes would be sensationalized. In the end, the Society decided to include a short, factual account that only said, "The Thornhill case of 1,919 was one of the most serious criminal investigations in county history," without going into details that might make people want to read about it. The Harrison County Historical Society keeps the sealed records of the case, which include copies of the journals and pictures of the evidence. Only qualified researchers with real academic or law enforcement purposes can get in. In a 1967 interview, the curator of the society said, Some parts of this case are too disturbing to be made public. There are details that would serve no historical purpose, but would only satisfy morbid curiosity. Because of this policy of limited access, there have been a lot of rumors and myths about the case, many of which don't match up with the facts that have been documented. Some versions of local folklore say that the Thornhills practiced witchcraft or were not fully human, which are things that are not mentioned in any historical records. These embellishments may signify a psychological necessity to categorize such extreme behavior as beyond human capability. Dr. Samuel Grafton, a cultural anthropologist who studied the evolution of the Thornhill legend in Appalachian communities, wrote in a 1969 paper, "The transformation of the Thornhill brothers from human predators to supernatural entities in local folklore represents a common pattern in the cultural processing of extreme deviance. By reimagining the brothers as witches, shapeshifters, or other non-human entities, the community creates a psychological buffer between themselves and the disturbing reality that such individuals emerged from their midst. What is most troubling about the Mountain Brothers case is not what was found, but what is still unknown, the full extent of their crimes, any links they may have had to other offenders like them, and most importantly, whether Jeremiah Thornhill actually lived past the last journal entry in 1943. These questions keep coming up without clear answers. The cave where the last journals were found looked like it had been empty for years, but there were no remains that could be definitely identified as Jeremiah's. According to a report from a forensic team that looked at the cave in 1965, the absence of identifiable human remains that could be attributed to Jeremiah Thornhill leaves open the possibility that he may have departed the location after his final journal entry. Given his age at the time, approximately 69 years, it seems unlikely that he could have established another operation elsewhere, but the possibility cannot be entirely discounted. The Appalachian Mountains' thick forests and hidden valleys have kept their secrets safe for decades. Sometimes, hikers or hunters find strange stone formations or poorly built shelters in very remote areas that remind them of what they read in the Thornhill journals. A report sent to the National Park Service in 1958, long before the Thornhill case was found again, said that a hiker found a strange arrangement of stones in a cleared area about 40 miles south of the Blackwell Pass. The stones looked like they made a table or altar-like structure. The report said that strange marks or symbols had been carved into a number of nearby trees, but it didn't include any pictures or detailed descriptions of these markings. None of these discoveries have been definitively linked to the brothers, but each one brings the case back into the public eye and raises the unsettling possibility that some part of the Mountain Brothers' legacy may still be hidden in the shadows of those old hills. A retired park ranger who was interviewed by a local newspaper in 1967 said, "These mountains have countless hidden places where a person could live for years without being discovered: caves, remote hollows, abandoned mining camps. The Appalachians are full of places where someone who knows the terrain could disappear. The question isn't whether it's possible to vanish into these hills, but rather how many have done so over the years and for what purposes." Robert Thornton, an FBI analyst, was the last person to officially comment on the case. He looked at the evidence in 1967 as part of a larger study on how predators behave in rural areas. His conclusion, which was made public in 1969 through sealed documents, said, "The Thornhill case is a rare example of methodical predation in an environment where social isolation served as both a disguise for the offenders and a trap for their victims. The brothers' understanding of human psychology, their patience, and their geographical isolation created the perfect conditions for their activities. What is most disturbing is not that such people existed, but that they operated undetected for so long, raising the question of how many similar cases might still be out there." The Harrison County Sheriff's Department officially thought that both Thornhill brothers were dead as of 1,969, but no death certificates were ever issued, and the case was still open, making it one of the longest-running unsolved cases in West Virginia law enforcement history. A note in the department's cold case files from March 1968 says, "Periodic review continues, as required by departmental policy, but no active investigation ongoing due to presumed death of all subjects and the passage of time." The Appalachian region has changed a lot since the Mountain Brothers were around. The area used to be very isolated, but now roads are better, communities are linked, and the deep isolation is lessened. But there are still huge areas of wilderness, and even today there are places that few people visit. In 1965, the Appalachian Regional Commission did a study that found more than 300 communities in the mountain range that could only be reached by unpaved roads or trails. Many of these communities were miles away from the nearest police station. The mountains don't tell anyone what they think. People don't want to hear the stories that the winds that blow through the passes carry. The roads go through valleys where shadows stay even in the middle of the day. And sometimes, people who travel through the most remote parts of the Appalachian Range say they feel something strange, the feeling that someone is watching them from just beyond the tree line, judging them, measuring their isolation, vulnerability, and suitability. Local guides and park rangers say that hikers sometimes feel anxious for no reason in some areas, especially near dusk when the forest gets quiet and the shadows get longer. A memo from the Park Service in 1966 says, visitors to the eastern section of the state forest sometimes say they feel like they are being followed or watched, even though there is no evidence of other people being in the area. This is probably due to normal wilderness anxiety. But it is interesting that these reports are consistent in certain places. Most of them go on with their trips without any problems. But some people might meet a helpful local who shows them a shortcut through the mountains, a less traveled path that will get them to their destination faster. A path that isn't on any map. A path that goes into the woods where cell phones don't work, and the only sounds are the wind whispering through old trees and the occasional call of a bird far away. Some of these travelers are never seen again. The mountains keep their secrets, and the story of the Thornhill brothers is a sad reminder that the most dangerous predators are those who know not only the terrain, but also the psychology of their prey. These are the people who know how to act like guides and helpers, offering help and direction while leading the unwary into situations from which there is no return. In a final report on the case in 1969, one researcher said, "The true horror of the Mountain Brothers lies not in the specifics of their actions, as disturbing as those were, but in the revelation that such methodical predation could occur within the framework of ordinary human interaction. The brothers did not skulk in shadows or present obvious danger signals. They offered rest, food, and guidance to weary travelers. They conversed, traded, and engaged in the normal commerce of human society. And in doing so, they exploited the basic trust that allows communities to function. Perhaps that is their most disturbing legacy, the shadow of doubt cast over the simple act of accepting help from a stranger on a lonely road."